My son had barely cleared the departure doors at Pearson when my neighbor sent me 3 words that changed everything. I was still in the drop-off lane, hazard lights blinking, watching the automatic doors close behind him. 31 years old, carry-on slung over his shoulder, baseball cap pulled low. He hadn't looked back. That stung a little. The way things sting when you're 63 and you've learned to feel them quietly. I put the CRV in drive and merged back onto Airport Road, heading south toward the QEW, thinking about nothing in particular. The weather. The drive. Whether I'd stop for a coffee. My phone buzzed on the console. My neighbor, Dorothy, 66 years old, retired school teacher, been living 3 doors down from us for 12 years. She didn't text often, and when she did, it was usually a heads up about a package on our porch or a question about the recycling schedule. This was different. Don't come home yet, Bob. Paul's car is in your driveway. I don't have a good feeling. Check your camera before you do anything. I pulled into the Tim Hortons just off the on-ramp. Engine running. A line of cars snaked through the drive-thru behind me. I opened the security app on my phone, a simple ring system I'd installed myself 2 winters ago after a rash of car break-ins on our street, and tapped into the front door camera. The footage was live. My driveway. My house. A black Audi I recognized immediately parked at an angle, like whoever drove it didn't much care about staying straight. The front door was ajar. I switched to the indoor camera in my home office, the one I'd added last spring without telling my wife. Not because I suspected anything, because I'd left a plumbing job half-finished for a client and kept losing paperwork, and I wanted to be able to check remotely if I'd left drawings on the desk. A man was standing at my filing cabinet. He was in his mid-50s, broad shoulders. The kind of tan you get from standing on job sites in summer. Paul Mercer, my wife's business partner, real estate developer, the man she'd been working alongside for 3 years building a property portfolio in Halton region. He was photographing documents, slowly, methodically, 1 page at a time, holding his phone over my open filing cabinet with the care of someone who had done this before. A woman I didn't recognize stood in the doorway. Younger, blazer, notebook. She nodded when Paul set something aside. They were not in a hurry. My wife walked past the office doorway. She glanced in, smiled at Paul, and kept walking toward the kitchen. I sat in that Tim Hortons parking lot for a long time. Long enough that someone knocked on my window thinking I was having a medical event. I waved them off. I wasn't having a medical event. I was watching 34 years of marriage dissolve on a 4-inch screen. I didn't drive home. I called Dorothy instead. She picked up on the second ring. I asked her what she'd seen. She told me Paul's Audi had pulled into my driveway approximately 10 minutes after I'd left for the airport that morning. She'd been pruning her front hedge. She saw my wife open the front door before he'd even knocked. She saw them greet each other the way people greet each other when nobody is watching. Then they went inside and the door closed. Dorothy had hesitated before texting me. She said that quietly, like a confession. She told herself it was none of her business. Then she thought about what she would have wanted someone to do for her 12 years ago, before her own husband left. She picked up the phone. I told her I needed somewhere to park for a few hours. She said to come right over. Dorothy lived in a semi-detached on Caldwell Road with a garage she never used for a car. She made me a cup of tea I didn't drink and sat across from me at her kitchen table while I pulled up the security footage on my laptop. We watched together in silence, Paul photographing my documents, the woman with the notebook, my wife moving through her own house like nothing at all was happening. Dorothy set down her mug. She said carefully that she hadn't wanted to say anything before, but that she'd overheard a phone call. 3 weeks ago, through the fence. My wife hadn't known she was in the backyard. The words my wife had said were these: "Once the assessment comes back, we can move forward with everything. Paul says the timing is right." I didn't know what assessment meant. I thought I did. I went through my online banking that evening on Dorothy's laptop. I'd been a civil engineer for 35 years, retired 2 summers ago. My pension from the firm was direct deposited monthly into our joint TD checking account. My RRSP held just under $400,000. The house in Oakville was paid off, Had been for 6 years. The joint account was down $43,000 from where it should have been. The withdrawals were spread across 4 months, small enough individually not to trip an alert. Transferred to a personal account I didn't recognize. My wife's name on a solo account I hadn't known existed. Then I checked the RRSP beneficiary on my online portal. I logged in with the password I'd had for 11 years. The beneficiary had been changed 8 weeks ago. It no longer listed my son. It listed my wife as sole beneficiary. I hadn't done that. I sat with that for a long time. My wife had access to my login. I'd given it to her years ago so she could check balances if she needed to while I was on a job site with no cell service. I'd trusted her the way you trust someone after 34 years. Without thinking about it, the way you trust the floor to hold you when you step out of bed. I called my old colleague Jim next. We'd worked together for nearly 20 years before I retired. He'd moved into IT consulting and was living in Burlington now, 40 minutes east. I told him what I'd found. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked me to forward everything. I had the footage, the account screenshots, the beneficiary change confirmation. He called me back in 40 minutes. He said, "Bob, this isn't disorganization. Someone made a deliberate effort here." He also said he could look deeper if I needed him to. I told him I needed him to. Dorothy gave me her spare room that night. She brought me a spare toothbrush still in the package. She didn't ask a lot of questions. She said her door was open as long as I needed it. I lay in the dark and thought about the last several months. My wife had been asking me questions. Small ones. Repeated. Had I taken my blood pressure medication? Had I remembered to renew the car insurance? She'd mentioned twice to people at dinner that I'd been forgetting things lately. Which wasn't untrue. But the way she said it had a particular weight to it, the way you place something carefully so that other people notice it later. There had been a doctor's appointment she'd booked for me in September. A general checkup, she'd said. The doctor had asked me a series of questions that I'd thought were routine. I'd answered them fine. I'd forgotten about it entirely until now. Lying in Dorothy's spare room, staring at a water stain on the ceiling. An assessment. I understood now what that word had meant on the phone. She and Paul had been building a file, documenting moments of forgetfulness, steering me toward a physician's office for a cognitive evaluation. If that evaluation had returned anything equivocal, anything that could be interpreted as early decline, they would have had paperwork. They would have had a case to pursue a capacity assessment through the courts. A finding of incapacity in Ontario gives a guardian control over financial decisions, property, savings, everything. I am 63 years old and I am sharper than I have ever been. But I can see how the story would have read on paper. The next morning, Jim sent me a folder. Paul Mercer had done this before. Jim had pulled property records and court filings going back 8 years. In 2016, a man in Hamilton had filed a civil suit against Paul, alleging financial manipulation and fraudulent transfer of property. The case had settled out of court. The man's name was Gordon. His wife at the time had been Paul's business partner. The marriage had collapsed. Gordon had lost a rental property he'd owned before the marriage. The playbook was identical. I thought about my son, living in Calgary now, working in oil and gas. We'd been close when he was young. Then distance and time and the particular drift that happens between fathers and sons when neither one is willing to say what's actually wrong. He called on birthdays. Christmas. We talked about hockey and his work. And not much else. My wife had been calling him more than I knew. Jim found that out too, not through anything illegal, just through the phone records I had access to on our shared plan. She'd called our son 11 times in the past 2 months. Long calls. 40 minutes. 50. I didn't know what she'd said to him, but I could guess. I went back to the house on a Tuesday morning. My wife was at a yoga class she attended every Tuesday and Thursday from 9 to 10:30. I still knew her schedule. I'd lived alongside it for 3 decades. Dorothy drove me. We parked 2 streets over. I let myself in through the side door with my key, moved through the kitchen, and spent 40 minutes. I installed 3 small cameras, motion-activated, wireless, cloud storage. one behind the plant on the living room bookshelf, one in my home office aimed at my desk, in addition to the Ring camera already there, one in the kitchen, tucked behind the microwave hood where the vent opening gave a clear angle on the island and the back door. I was back in Dorothy's CRV with 3 minutes to spare before my wife's class ended. I watched the feeds from Dorothy's kitchen table. That afternoon, my wife called Paul. He picked up immediately. I watched her stand at the island, one hand wrapped around a coffee mug, and I listened. She said, "Jim Sutherland called the house looking for Bob, old colleague of his. He sounded worried." Paul said, "Don't engage. If Bob reaches out to old contacts, that only helps us. The more erratic his behavior appears, the stronger the file looks." My wife said, "Quieter. I just want this done, Paul. It's been 2 years of planning." Paul said, "It's almost done. The assessment was inconclusive, but we can request a reassessment." Ellison says, "If we come back with more documented incidents, more corroboration from family." My wife said, "I talked to our son again last week." Paul said, "What did he say?" My wife said, "He's worried about his father. I've been laying the groundwork for months. He thinks Bob is declining. He'd testify to that if it came to a hearing." I closed the laptop and sat with my hands flat on Dorothy's kitchen table. My son didn't know. He couldn't. He was worried about his father because his mother had spent months telling him to be worried. She'd taken the natural distance between us and sharpened it into something deliberate. Told him I was forgetting things, losing my temper, not myself. And he'd believed her because she was his mother, and he was 1,400 kilometers away and had no reason not to. I thought about the last time we'd spoken. I'd called him in October, just to talk. He'd been polite but distant. He'd asked twice if I was sleeping all right. At the time, I thought it was just his way. Now I understood what seed had been planted before I called. I asked Dorothy if I could use her landline. She didn't ask why. I called Jim. I told him what I'd heard. He said, "Bob, you need a lawyer before this goes any further." I told him I needed one more day. He said, "1 day, then I'm driving you to a paralegal myself." That evening, the kitchen camera picked up my wife on FaceTime. Our son's face on her laptop screen. I watched her sit at the island with a glass of wine, and I watched her talk to him for 40 minutes. And by the end of it, my son's face had the particular expression of someone who has been slowly convinced of something and doesn't realize the convincing has been happening. She said, at one point, "Your father has been calling people I've never heard of. Old contacts. Acting. Paranoid. Secretive. I'm frightened, sweetheart. I don't know what he might do." My son said, "What do you mean, what he might do?" She said, "I just think we need the right support in place. For everyone's sake. Including his." He said slowly, "Whatever you need, Mum." I turned off the monitor. Dorothy was standing in the doorway. She'd heard enough. She said quietly, "Bob, call him." I said, "Not yet. Not until I have something he can't argue with." She nodded. She understood. Jim came to Dorothy's the following morning with his own laptop and spent 4 hours while I watched the camera feeds. He pulled Paul's financial records through public filings and land registry databases. He found property that had been transferred into a numbered company registered 3 months ago. My name was nowhere on it. The numbered company had 2 directors, my wife and Paul Mercer. In that company were 2 investment properties my wife and I had purchased together over the last 6 years as part of her real estate work. We'd both signed on them. Our joint names on the deed. The transfer documents were dated 5 weeks ago. 1 signature on each was mine. I had never signed them. Jim printed everything. He stacked the pages and set them on the table and said, "That's forgery. That's not a civil matter." I called a criminal lawyer that afternoon, explained what I had. She said to come in the next morning and bring everything. I had one more call to make first. My son answered on the 3rd ring. He sounded cautious, the way you sound when you've been told to expect something worrying. I said, "I need you to listen to me without saying anything, until I'm finished." Can you do that? A pause. Then, yeah, Dad. I talked for 20 minutes. I told him everything. In order, from the Tim Hortons parking lot to Dorothy's spare room, to the camera footage, to the forged signatures. I told him about Paul's history in Hamilton. I told him about the $43,000. I told him his name had been removed from my RRSP beneficiary without my knowledge. The line was silent for a long time after I stopped talking. Then my son said, "She told me you'd been acting erratic, that you'd threatened her, that you'd said things." I said, "Did any of that sound like me?" Another silence. Longer this time. I waited. He said, "She's been calling me since August. Every week. I thought she was just worried. I thought." He stopped. I said, "She's been telling you a story. Paul Mercer has done this before. I can send you everything right now." He said, "Send it." I forwarded him the folder Jim had built, the property records, the transfer documents, the beneficiary change, the audio from the kitchen. I didn't say anything while he went through it. I listened to his breathing. After 15 minutes, he said, voice different now, stripped of the wariness, "Dad, what do you need me to do?" I told him. He booked a flight to Toronto that night. My wife didn't know he was coming. She thought he was flying in the following week for a visit she'd arranged. She thought that visit would include sitting down with the family's legal advisor to discuss a capacity assessment. She thought her son would be on her side of the table. He landed at Pearson at 6:15 in the morning. I picked him up in Dorothy's car. He came through the arrival's door and stopped when he saw me. He looked older than the last time. Or maybe I was looking more carefully. He crossed the floor and put his arms around me. I held on for a moment. Then we drove to Tim Hortons, sat in a booth near the window, and I laid out the plan. My wife had a meeting with Paul and their lawyer, a man named Ellison, scheduled for that evening at the house. They were meeting to finalize the approach for the reassessment request to document, in writing, what they intended to present to the court as evidence of my incapacity. I wanted them to do it in my living room while I was watching. At 4 o'clock, Jim enabled a live recording function through the home network that would capture all 7 camera feeds simultaneously in high resolution. At 4:45, Dorothy drove me to the end of our street and waited. At 5 on the dot, my son walked through the front door of his mother's house. I watched the feeds on Jim's laptop. My wife was in the kitchen when he came in. She crossed to hug him, and for a moment her face held the expression I remembered from when he was small. Then she pulled back and said, "Paul and Robert are on their way. I'm glad you're here, sweetheart. This has been so hard." My son said, "I know, Mum." He sat at the island. He accepted the cup of tea she made him. He asked about her week. He was steady. Paul arrived at 5:15 with Ellison. The lawyer was mid-60s, careful, carrying a leather portfolio. He set it on the dining room table and opened it without being asked. He said, without looking up, "Mrs. Caldwell, we should be able to have the application filed by end of next week if your son's statement is formalized today." My wife said, "He's here. He's willing to give it." Ellison looked at my son. He said, "We'll need a written account of specific incidents. Dates, if possible. Behavioral changes. Memory lapses. Any expressions of paranoia or hostile." My son said, "I'm not giving you that." The room went quiet. My wife said, "Sweetheart." My son said, "I've been going through the documents Dad sent me. The property transfers, the bank account, the RRSP." My wife's face changed. Paul, standing near the window, said, "Those documents are not what he told you they are." My son said, "Then explain why his name isn't on a numbered company that holds 2 properties he co-owns." Paul said, "The transfer was routine, part of a restructuring." My son said, with his forged signature, Ellison closed the leather portfolio. He said quietly to Paul, "You didn't tell me about any of this." Paul said, "Stay out of it." My son reached for his phone on the table and said, "Dad, come in." I walked from Dorothy's car to my own front door. 34 years I'd lived in this house. I'd re-insulated the attic myself. The winter my son was born. I'd retiled the kitchen floor the year my wife said the old ones were dated. I'd built the deck in the backyard over 2 weekends with my son watching from a lawn chair asking questions about every cut I made. I turned my key in the lock. My wife looked at me from across the dining room table. Whatever she'd planned to say didn't come. I looked at Paul. I looked at the lawyer. I set Jim's folder on the table. I said, "Gordon Whitfield filed a civil suit against you in Hamilton in 2016. His wife was your business partner too." Paul said nothing. I said, "The land registry doesn't lie. Neither does a handwriting analyst." Ellison stood up. He said, "Paul, I need to know right now whether there are forged instruments associated with this matter." Paul said, "Sit down." Ellison said, "I will not sit down." He picked up his portfolio. He said, "To no one in particular, I was engaged to assist with a capacity proceeding. I was not engaged to be associated with fraud." He walked to the front door without another word and let himself out. The room was very quiet. My wife sat down at the table. She looked at our son. Her expression was something I couldn't name, something between grief and the particular shame of being seen clearly by someone you love. She said, "I did this for us, for you, your father's pension, the house I wanted it secured. I wanted us to be." My son said, "Stop." She stopped. He said, "You've been calling me for months, telling me my father was losing his mind. You made me think he was dangerous. You used me to build a legal case against him." His voice was level, quiet. "You're my mother. I believed you because you're my mother." She said, "Your father never..." My son said, "Dad came to my hockey games at 6 in the morning for 8 years. He drove 8 hours in a snowstorm when I was in the hospital in second year. He has never once, not once, given me a reason not to trust him." A pause. "You gave me a reason to distrust him because it was convenient." My wife said nothing. Paul moved toward the back door. Jim had called the non-emergency police line 40 minutes earlier. 2 officers from Halton Regional Police arrived as Paul's hand touched the door handle. I gave my full statement that night. My son gave his. Dorothy gave hers, the conversation she'd overheard over the fence, everything she'd observed. Jim submitted the technical documentation, the camera recordings, the network timestamps, the original and altered beneficiary records. My wife and Paul were taken to the station for questioning. My wife was released that night, pending charges. Paul was held on the strength of Jim's documentation and the Hamilton civil record. 3 weeks later, the charges were filed. My wife was charged with fraud over $5,000, breach of trust, and 1 count of document forgery. Paul was charged with fraud, forgery, and 1 count relating to the Hamilton matter that Ontario prosecutors had quietly reopened. His lawyer tried 3 times to have Paul's prior matter excluded. The judge declined all 3 times. The capacity proceeding was dropped the morning after the recordings were submitted. The divorce proceedings took 8 months. Long by any measure, except the measure of 34 years. The house stayed mine. The RRSP was restored to its original terms. My son's name returned to the beneficiary form. The $43,000, my wife was ordered to repay in full from the assets she held in her personal account. The 2 investment properties, after lengthy argument and a very good real estate lawyer, were returned to my name, pending sale. I sold one. I kept the other. A small bungalow in Burlington that I rent to a retired couple now. They send me Christmas cards. My son moved back to Ontario. Not into the house, he rented a place in Hamilton, started over. We have dinner on Sundays now. Sometimes he helps me in the yard. Last fall we spent a Saturday afternoon installing new eavesdrows on the back of the house. The 2 of us on ladders, passing screws back and forth, not saying much. At one point he asked if I needed a break. I said, "I'm 63, not dead." He laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind I hadn't heard from him in years. I thought about something Dorothy said to me the morning after everything came apart. We were sitting in her kitchen, both of us tired, and she said, "You know what I kept thinking? All those hours? I kept thinking about the night my husband left. How I wished, so many times, that someone had just knocked on my door and said, 'I see what's happening. I'm here.'" She looked at her coffee mug. "That's all I did for you, Bob." I knocked. I told her it was enough. More than enough. My son asked me once during those 8 months of proceedings how I'd managed to hold it together, how I hadn't broken down or made a desperate move or shown up at the house in a way that would have played into everything they were trying to say about me. I thought about it for a moment. I said, "I'm an engineer. You look at the structure, you find the weak points, you reinforce them one at a time. You don't blow up the building." He smiled at that. I said, "And I had Dorothy. And Jim. And eventually, I had you." There's a lesson in all of this that I've turned over many times since. Not about marriage, specifically. Not even about betrayal. It's about the particular blindness that comes with comfort. 34 years and I never once looked at the accounts without my wife on the phone asking me to. Never read a document she put in front of me before I signed. Trusted that her access to my login was a practical convenience, not a vulnerability. Trusted because I had no reason not to. And eventually, that became the same thing as not paying attention. I'm not saying be suspicious of everyone who loves you. That's not the lesson. The lesson is, trust should never mean closing your eyes. The people you love deserve better than your blind faith. They deserve the kind of trust you maintain actively. The kind that stays open because it has nothing to hide. I know that now. Cost me more than I should have paid to learn it. Some mornings I drive past the house and I think about the man who built it. Younger. Certain. I was so certain about everything. Back then. What we were building. What it would look like when we were old. I'm 63 years old. Still sharp. Still here. My son called this morning. Just to talk. We talked for an hour about nothing important. Hockey. The weather. Whether I was sleeping all right. I said I was. And I meant it. If you've stayed with me through all of this, drop a 2 in the comments. I'd like to know you were here. And if any part of this story sounds familiar, if someone close to you has ever made you doubt yourself, made you feel smaller, made you wonder if your own memory could be trusted, I want you to hear this clearly. Trust the people who show up, not the ones who explain why others shouldn't be trusted. There's a difference. And it matters more than most things. Take care of yourselves and check your accounts.